Obscure history tends to be forgotten because it's so dang terrifying. From being buried alive and mummified alive to human flycatchers, pirates, and more, today is totally going to make your mind spin. The legend of Alexander the Great, one of history's most renowned conquerors, continues to captivate scholars and enthusiasts alike. Alexander established the ancient world's largest empire by the time he turned 25. Among the many mysteries surrounding his life and death, one particularly intriguing theory suggests that he was buried alive. He died in 323 BC, and he was apparently suffering from a rare disease. Some historians are like, yeah, buried alive. That's how he went. Turns out that during the embalming process, a coma-like state could have been mistaken for death, leading to his premature burial. So in ancient times, the line between life and death was pretty blurry, and medical knowledge was a little basic compared to today. Practices such as embalming and burial rites varied widely, leaving room for misunderstandings and misconceptions about death. Encyclopedia Britannica says that Alexander died on June 13th, nearly a fortnight after collapsing during a party. Britannica said that it happened after the conqueror was challenged to drink a punch bowl of wine in one sitting. He collapsed during the party, complaining of searing back pain, and after 10 days, Alexander's soldiers were brought in to see their king one final time. Quoting historian Arrian, at the time the king could no longer speak, but he struggled to raise his head and gave each man a greeting with his eyes. Though he was declared dead, Alexander's body did not begin to show the typical signs of decay, leading to claims he was a god. The 32-year-old was paralyzed in the last days of his life, something that was likely caused by an autoimmune disease. This would have left Alexander almost totally unmovable, to the point that doctors may not have seen that he was still breathing when he was buried. Crazy! In ancient Asia, death by elephant was a popular method of capital punishment, and this was both in South and Southeast Asia, particularly in India. Most commonly employed by royalty, the elephants were used to signify both the ruler's power of life and death over his subjects and his ability to control wild animals. Historically, the elephants were under the constant control of a driver, or mahout, thus enabling a ruler to grant a last-minute reprieve and display merciful qualities. Several such exercises of mercy are recorded in various kingdoms. The kings of Siam trained their elephants to roll the convicted person about the ground rather slowly so that he is not badly hurt. The Emperor Akbar is said to have used this technique to chastise rebels, and then in the end the prisoners, presumably much chastened, were given their lives. On one occasion, Akbar was recorded to have had a man thrown to the elephants to suffer 5 days of such treatment before finally pardoning him. Elephants were occasionally used in trial by ordeal, in which the condemned prisoner was released if he managed to fend off the elephant himself. These elephants could be taught to slowly break bones, crush skulls, twist off limbs, or even kill people using large weapons fitted to their tusks. The sight of elephants killing captives was recorded in contemporary journals and accounts of life in Asia by European travelers. The practice was eventually suppressed by the European colonial powers that colonized the region in the 18th and 19th centuries. But in some parts of Asia, this method of killing was still popular up until the late 19th century. While primarily confined to Asia, the practice was occasionally used by European and African powers, such as ancient Rome, and it was particularly to deal with mutinous soldiers. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs would use their slaves as flycatchers. They'd slather them in honey, which would attract any flies to their body, rather than to somebody without honey, and then that would trap and kill the flies. Thutpi II was an Egyptian pharaoh of the Old Kingdom who succeeded to the throne at a stupidly young age. And it might have been this privileged upbringing that ultimately resulted in him being one of Egypt's more demanding kings. He is usually mentioned as the longest reigning monarch in history, with some sources citing a 94-year reign. Other sources think it might have been 64. Nevertheless, he was king of Egypt for a very, very long time. And he detested the pesky insects, hence it was his idea to smear everybody in honey. And it worked. However, the insects were later regarded with admiration for their sheer persistence. Golden flies were often gifted to soldiers who showed such qualities on the battleground. Fly amulets were also crafted from gold, silver, bone, and more. Oh, and amethyst. Some of the best examples of gold fly pendants were found in the tomb of Queen Ahotep at Dra Abu el-Naga in the Theban necropolis. It is most likely that wearing a fly amulet was believed to give protection from insect bites or to ward off flies, a much more savory approach than coating somebody in honey. Since the end of the first big world mass extinction event, over 1,000 people have died from leftover unexploded explosive devices. During the Great War, an estimated 200 pounds of explosives were fired per square foot of territory on the Western Front. However, not all of these shells exploded. Since 1919, over 8,000 civilians and collectors have died from explosions caused by these in France and Belgium. So, if you do find unwanted munitions, they're sometimes destroyed in controlled explosions, but accidental detonation really happens. And then that's how people die. To go over some terminology, a dud is an unexploded projectile fired in anger against an enemy, but it fails to explode. A projectile not fired in anger, but which has failed to explode, is called a blind. Turns out 78 countries are contaminated by landmines from all of this. And a lot of people die from, well, these things just sort of hanging around. You're out for a walk, you don't know. Kaboom, that's the end for you. Between the 11th and 19th centuries, a number of Buddhist monks successfully managed to mummify themselves. They adopted a practice called Soku Shinbutsu, in which they gradually weaned themselves off of food and water and essentially starved themselves to death over the course of 1,000 days. The diet limits practitioners to only what can be foraged on a mountain, so nuts, buds, roots from trees. Some sources also report that berries may have entered the diet, as well as tree bark, pine needles. Time not spent foraging for food was spent in meditation on the mountain. From a spiritual perspective, this regimen was intended to toughen the spirit and distance oneself from the common human world. From a biological point of view, the severe diet rid the body of fat, muscle, and moisture, while also withholding nutrients from the body's natural biosphere of bacteria and parasites. The cumulative effect was to arrest decomposition after death. It was believed that by successfully mummifying themselves, the monks would achieve true enlightenment. Between 1081 and 1903, at least 17 monks managed to do this. The number might be higher, because some mummies might have never been recovered, but bonkers. So there's one man who survived both the atomic event of Hiroshima and then also Nagasaki. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was a 29-year-old naval engineer on a 3-month business trip to Hiroshima, and he survived the atomic event from August 6th of 1945, despite being less than 2 miles away from ground zero. On August 7th, he boarded a train back to his hometown of Nagasaki. On August 9th, while being with colleagues at an office building, another big kaboom split the sound barrier. A flash of white light filled the sky. Yamaguchi emerged from the wreckage with only minor injuries on top of his current injuries. He had survived 2 nuclear blasts in 2 days and lived to tell the tale. The fastest surgeon ever wound up causing a 300% mortality rate. So surgeon Robert Liston was considered the fastest in the West. He was a pioneer in speed surgery. But when performing a battlefield amputation in front of a group of spectators, Liston cut through his patient's leg so quickly that he accidentally cut the fingers off of the person who was helping him. One man who witnessed the surgery collapsed and died of a heart attack. Then Liston's patient and his assistant died of red fluid poisoning from their joint amputation, making him the only surgeon in history to have a 300% mortality rate. Sure, we've all heard about the Boston Tea Party, but what about the Boston Molasses disaster? On January 15th of 1919, a 90-foot wide cast iron tank filled to the brim with icky, sticky molasses exploded and spilled 2.5 million gallons of crude molasses into the street of Boston. The brown stuff ran through the streets like a tsunami, with 15-foot high waves reaching speeds of 35 miles per hour. This demolished everything in its path, toppling buildings, and eventually killing 21 and injuring 150. Not so fun. From the 1940s to the 1970s, Yale and other Ivy League schools like Harvard and Brown required their freshmen to pose nude for a photo shoot. The goal was to gather material for a massive study into how rickets and scoliosis developed, and that involved sticking pins to the back of the subjects, no matter the gender. Generations of the country's elite who went to the Ivy Leagues posed, and the archives included the nude photos of well-known figures. We're talking George W. Bush, Hillary Clinton, Meryl Streep. The photos are simple black and white images of each individual, standing upright from front, back, and side perspectives. The larger project was run by William Herbert Sheldon and Ernest Albert Hooton, who may have been using the data to support their theory on body types and social hierarchy. But after all this news was leaked, the study was denounced, the photos have since been destroyed. Finally, the world's most successful pirate in history was a lady named Ching Shih. She was a body seller in China until the commander of the Red Flag Fleet bought and married her. But her husband considered her his equal, and she became an active pirate commander in said fleet. Well, that's all folks. I've been Alexa, resident emo girly. See ya!